Hey everyone, settle in for tonight's journey. We're stepping inside the stone walls of a medieval monastery, into a world where time moved differently, where silence held meaning, and where the rhythm of each day followed patterns that hadn't changed in centuries. Before we begin, if you genuinely enjoy these explorations into the past, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always wonderful to see this community spread across the world. Now dim your lights, get comfortable, and let's walk together into the quiet, ordered world of medieval monastic life. Imagine waking in complete darkness, not to an alarm or the glow of a screen, but to the sound of a bell cutting through the night. It's sometime around 2 in the morning, though medieval monks didn't think in terms of precise minutes or digital clocks. They measured time by the position of stars, the feel of the air, and the practiced rhythm of their days. This was Matins, the first of 8 prayer services that would structure every hour until sleep came again. In the dormitory, a long room lined with simple beds, monks rose without complaint. There was no groaning, no snoozing, no bargaining for 5 more minutes. This was simply what you did. Sleep was interrupted not because rest didn't matter, but because prayer mattered more. The dormitory was cold. Medieval monasteries were built of stone, beautiful and enduring, but utterly unforgiving in winter. Monks slept in their habits, the long woolen robes that identified them as members of a religious order. They owned almost nothing. Perhaps 2 tunics, a pair of sandals or simple shoes, a scapular draped over their shoulders. Everything belonged to the monastery, not to the individual. Even the bed they slept in wasn't truly theirs. When a monk died, another would take his place in that same narrow space, continuing the cycle without pause. Rising in darkness, they descended stone stairs worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The church, attached to the monastery complex, waited for them. It was the heart of everything, the reason the monastery existed at all. Inside, candles flickered, casting long shadows across vaulted ceilings and carved pillars. The air smelled of beeswax, incense, and the faint mustiness of old stone. Matins, also called vigils, was the longest service of the day. It could last 2 hours or more, filled with psalms, readings from scripture, and prayers for the living and the dead. Monks stood in the choir, arranged in rows facing one another, and their voices rose and fell in chanted rhythm. This wasn't singing in the way we think of it today. It was plainsong, Gregorian chant, melody that moved like water, without sharp edges or dramatic flourishes. The words mattered more than the tune, and the words were almost always in Latin. For monks, this wasn't merely ritual. It was work. The phrase, Opus Dei, the work of God, described what they did when they gathered to pray. It was labor, just as real as tilling fields or copying manuscripts, and it was their primary responsibility. Saint Benedict, whose rule guided most medieval monasteries, believed that monks existed to sanctify time itself, to fill the hours with devotion so that every moment became an offering. Matins was only the beginning. After Matins came a brief return to the dormitory, perhaps an hour of sleep if the night was long, or simply time spent in silence, waiting for dawn. When light began to creep across the horizon, the bell rang again. This was Lauds, the morning prayer. Lauds was shorter than Matins, more focused, a greeting to the new day. Monks praised God as light returned to the world, acknowledging that another cycle had begun. The structure was similar, psalms and readings and chants, but the tone was different. There was something almost hopeful in Lauds, a quiet celebration that darkness had passed and the monastery had survived another night. With Lauds complete, the day truly started. Around 6 in the morning came prime, the first of what were called the little hours. These smaller services punctuated the day at regular intervals. Terce at 9 in the morning, sext at noon, none at 3 in the afternoon. Each lasted perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, just long enough to pause whatever work was happening and return to prayer. These hours weren't burdensome. They were anchors. In a world without clocks on every wall, without phones buzzing with notifications, these bells and prayers told monks where they were in the day. Time didn't slip away unnoticed. It was marked, honored, and given meaning. Between the hours of prayer came work, and this is where the romantic image of medieval monks often falls apart. We imagine them peacefully tending gardens, quietly copying beautiful manuscripts, living lives of serene contemplation. And yes, some of that happened. But much of monastic work was hard, physical, repetitive, and dirty. Early monasteries, especially those following the rule of Saint Benedict, believed that monks should support themselves through their own labor. Idleness was considered dangerous, a gateway to distraction and sin. So monks worked. If the monastery owned farmland, and most did, monks spent hours in the fields. They plowed, planted, harvested. They tended vegetable gardens that provided onions, cabbage, carrots, peas, beans, turnips. Herbs grew in carefully maintained plots, not just for cooking but for medicine. Fennel, sage, rosemary, mint, and dozens of others were cultivated with the same care given to prayer. Monks understood that a body weakened by illness couldn't serve God well, so they learned which plants eased headaches, settled stomachs, or helped wounds heal. Some monasteries had infirmaries staffed by monks who spent years studying the properties of every root and leaf in their gardens. Orchards required constant attention. Apple and pear trees needed pruning, protection from pests, careful harvesting. The fruit wasn't just eaten fresh. It was dried, preserved, or pressed into cider. Cistercian monks, a stricter order that emerged in the late 11th century, became famous for their agricultural skill. They transformed marginal land into productive estates, draining swamps, clearing forests, building irrigation systems. These weren't men detached from the physical world. They reshaped it, one field at a time. Some monks worked as bakers, rising before dawn to prepare bread for the community. Bread was the foundation of every meal, and not all bread was the same. Coarse, dark loaves made from rye or barley fed most monks, but finer white bread, made from carefully sifted wheat flour, was reserved for the abbot and honored guests. The difference in bread signaled status even within a community that claimed to reject worldly hierarchy. Brewers worked alongside bakers. Monasteries produced vast amounts of beer, not as indulgence but as necessity. Water was often unsafe to drink. Beer, with its mild alcohol content and brewing process that involved boiling, was far more reliable. Monks drank it with breakfast, with meals throughout the day. Some monasteries gave each monk a gallon of beer daily, which sounds excessive until you remember that medieval beer was weaker than modern versions, closer to what we'd call small beer. Then there were the craftsmen. Monasteries needed blacksmiths to repair tools, carpenters to maintain buildings, masons to patch crumbling walls. Some monks became skilled in metalwork, glass-making, or weaving. Others worked in the kitchen, preparing meals according to strict dietary rules that we'll come back to. And some, the ones we tend to remember most, worked in the scriptorium. The scriptorium was the monastery's writing room, and it was a place of both reverence and frustration. Here, monks copied texts by hand, one painstaking letter at a time. They reproduced Bibles, psalters, prayer books, theological treatises, and works of classical literature. This work preserved knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. When we read Virgil or Ovid today, it's often because medieval monks decided their words were worth saving, even though the authors were pagan Romans who had never heard of Christ. Copying manuscripts was exhausting. Monks sat for hours at wooden desks, shoulders hunched, eyes straining in whatever light was available. Natural light was best, so scriptoria often had large windows, but on overcast days or in winter, work slowed to a crawl. Candles and lamps were forbidden near manuscripts because fire could destroy months of labor in minutes. The vellum they wrote on, made from treated animal skins, was expensive and difficult to prepare. Mistakes couldn't simply be erased. Errors had to be scraped away carefully, the surface smoothed, and the text rewritten. Ink, made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, sometimes faded or bled. Recipes varied, and a bad batch could ruin pages. Some manuscripts were illuminated, decorated with intricate borders, miniature paintings, and letters gilded in gold leaf. This required additional skills and materials. Gold was applied in paper-thin sheets, burnished to a shine with polished stones or even a dog's tooth, which monks discovered gave the best finish. Pigments came from minerals, plants, and insects, ground into fine powders and mixed with binding agents. Blue came from lapis lazuli, imported at great expense from Afghanistan. Red came from cinnabar or red lead. Green from malachite. These colors weren't just beautiful. They were investments, signs of a monastery's wealth and connections. But even without illumination, copying was grueling. Monks developed aching backs, stiff necks, and eye strain. In the margins of manuscripts, scribes sometimes left complaints. "The parchment is hairy," one wrote. "Now I've written the whole thing," another scrawled at the end of a text. "For Christ's sake, give me a drink," one exhausted monk noted. 3 fingers right, but the whole body suffers. These weren't men working in peaceful silence with beatific smiles. They were laborers, skilled and dedicated, but human. And speaking of silence, let's talk about what that actually meant in a medieval monastery. Popular imagination insists that monks took vows of silence, spending their lives in hushed tranquility, communicating only when absolutely necessary. That's not quite accurate. Monks didn't take vows of silence. What they did follow were rules about when and where silence was required. The rule of Saint Benedict discouraged idle chatter but didn't demand total muteness. Silence was expected in certain places and at certain times. The church, obviously. The dormitory. The refectory, where meals were eaten. During the Great Silence, the period from Compline, the final prayer of the night, until after lauds the next morning, speech was forbidden except in emergencies. But this created a problem. Sometimes communication was necessary. A monk working in the kitchen might need to ask for salt. A novice might not know where to find a particular tool. So monasteries, particularly those influenced by the reforms at Cluny in France, developed sign language. This wasn't a full language with grammar and syntax. It was a lexicon, a collection of specific signs representing objects and simple concepts. To signal bread, a monk formed a circle with his thumbs and forefingers. For milk, he made a milking gesture around his smallest finger. For honey, he let his tongue protrude slightly and moved his fingers as if licking them. Fish was indicated by moving a flat hand in a swimming motion. A book required pretending to turn pages. These signs numbered in the hundreds in some monasteries. Canterbury Cathedral Priory had at least 127 recorded signs by the mid-11th century. Different orders developed their own variations. Cistercians had one system, Carthusians another. Some signs were intuitive, others arbitrary. Monks learned them during their training as novices, practicing until the gestures became automatic. The system wasn't perfect. Complex ideas couldn't be conveyed. Conversations were impossible. The signs were meant for brief, practical exchanges, and even then, rules existed to prevent abuse. Using signs in the dormitory was forbidden entirely, because even silent communication could disturb rest or lead to distraction. Some visitors found monastic sign language absurd. Gerald of Wales, visiting Canterbury, complained that monks gestured wildly, whistling and flailing their arms in what he called mute chatter, behavior he thought violated the spirit of the rules they were supposedly following. But for monks, it was pragmatic. Silence preserved focus. Signs allowed function. The combination kept the monastery running without drowning in noise. Let's return to the daily schedule, because we've reached the most important part of the monastic day for the body, if not the soul. Meals. Medieval monks ate better than most people in their time, but the rules governing what they ate, when they ate, and how they ate were complex, contradictory, and frequently reinterpreted to suit convenience. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed 2 meals a day, typically one around midday, and another in early evening during the summer months. In winter, when daylight was scarce, monks often ate only once, in the afternoon. Wednesdays and Fridays were fast days, meaning only one meal regardless of season. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, the entire community fasted, eating sparingly and abstaining from foods considered luxurious. What qualified as luxurious? Meat from 4-legged animals. Saint Benedict's rule prohibited it entirely except for the sick. Beef, pork, mutton, goat, venison, these were forbidden. But fish was allowed. Birds were allowed. And this is where things got creative. Monks, being human, wanted variety. They wanted flavor. So they interpreted the rules generously. If it didn't walk on 4 legs, it wasn't technically meat. Offal, the internal organs of animals, didn't count as meat. Bacon, because it was cured, wasn't fresh meat and therefore acceptable. Some argued that newborn rabbits, which couldn't yet walk, weren't really 4-legged animals. Others claimed beavers, because they swam and had flat tails, were basically fish. These weren't jokes. Monks took these arguments seriously, debating them, writing justifications, finding loopholes large enough to drive a roasted pig through. By the later Middle Ages, many monasteries had given up pretending. Meat appeared regularly on monastic tables, especially on feast days. When challenged, abbots pointed out that the rule allowed meat for the sick, and surely long hours of prayer and work qualified everyone as at least mildly unwell. Some monasteries built separate dining rooms called misericords, claiming that fast restrictions only applied in the main refectory. Monks could eat forbidden foods as long as they did so in a different room. It was bureaucratic nonsense, but it worked. The basic monastic diet, even without loopholes, was substantial. Bread, as mentioned, formed the foundation. Each monk received about a pound daily. 2 cooked dishes accompanied each meal, usually vegetables, grains, or legumes. Pottage, a thick soup or stew made from whatever was available, appeared constantly. Peas, beans, lentils, cabbage, onions, turnips, all simmered together with herbs and sometimes a bit of fish or cheese. Eggs and dairy products were acceptable, so monks ate cheese, butter, and milk when available. Cheese, in particular, was valuable. It was nutritious, calorie-dense, easy to store, and could be aged for months. A well-stocked monastery kept wheels of cheese in its cellars, carefully monitored for mold or spoilage. Fruit, both fresh and dried, was common. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, all grown in monastic orchards. Wine was distributed daily, usually about 10 ounces per monk, though this varied. Beer, as noted earlier, flowed freely. Spices and expensive seasonings were technically discouraged as luxuries, but wealthier monasteries ignored this. Saffron, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, these appeared in monastic kitchens, especially when cooking for the abbot or important guests. Some monasteries developed reputations for sophisticated cuisine. Dishes like mussels steamed in white wine with saffron, crab meat mixed into scrambled eggs, even spice sauces that wouldn't seem out of place in a nobleman's hall. Monks justified this by arguing that good food honored God and attracted donors. Practically speaking, many monks came from wealthy families and expected a certain standard. Poverty was a vow, but comfort had its appeals. Meals were eaten communally in the refectory, a large hall with long tables. Monks sat on benches, usually on one side of the table only, facing inward. This arrangement allowed everyone to see the reader, a monk assigned to read aloud during meals. Silence was strictly enforced. While one monk read from the Bible, theological texts, or saints' lives, the others ate without speaking. Listeners were expected to focus on the reading, absorbing spiritual nourishment along with physical food. If a monk needed something, he used sign language or waited until the meal ended. Breaking silence during meals was punishable, though punishments varied. Minor infractions might earn a rebuke. Repeated violations could result in public penance or temporary exclusion from communal activities. Interestingly, the monk doing the reading didn't eat with everyone else. He was blessed before beginning and given a small amount of wine to keep his throat from drying out, but his actual meal came later, usually in the kitchen, after his duties were complete. This was seen as a service, a humble task that built character. Many roles in the monastery rotated weekly, ensuring that no one became too proud or complacent. You might read at meals one week, serve food the next, clean the refectory the week after. Everyone contributed. Everyone remained aware that their position, however important it felt, was temporary. After the midday meal came a period of rest. In summer, this might be a short nap, especially important for monks who had risen at 2 in the morning and worked through the heat of the day. In winter, rest was brief or skipped entirely, replaced by reading or quiet study. The afternoon brought more work, more prayer. Vespers, the evening prayer, occurred around sunset. This was one of the major hours, longer and more elaborate than terce or sext. Vespers marked the transition from day to night, a moment to offer thanks for the hours just past and prepare for the ones ahead. After Vespers came supper, if the season and day allowed for a second meal. Otherwise, monks spent the evening in communal reading, personal study, or silent meditation. The monastery had a library, sometimes modest, sometimes extensive. Books were precious, kept in locked chests or chained to desks to prevent theft. Monks read scripture, commentaries by church fathers, lives of saints, and sometimes classical texts. Monasteries preserved works by Virgil, Cicero, Seneca, not because monks admired pagan philosophy for its own sake, but because the language and rhetoric were useful for understanding Christian theology. Still, the preservation mattered. Without monastic scribes copying these texts, entire branches of classical literature would have vanished. As darkness deepened, the bell rang one final time. Compline, the last prayer of the day, was quiet, almost intimate. It was a preparation for sleep and, symbolically, for death, which monks understood as merely a longer sleep. Prayers asked for protection through the night, for forgiveness of the day's failings, for peace. After Compline, the great silence began. Monks filed out of the church and returned to the dormitory without speaking. They climbed into their narrow beds, pulled thin blankets over themselves, and surrendered to sleep. In a few hours, the bell would ring again, and the cycle would repeat. This rhythm, this endless repetition, might sound monotonous. Wake, pray, work, eat, pray, sleep. Day after day, year after year, until death. And yes, it was monotonous. That was the point. Benedict designed his rule to create stability, to eliminate distractions, to focus the mind entirely on God. Variety was the world's temptation. Monasteries rejected it. They offered something else, a life stripped of everything except what was essential: prayer, labor, community, and silence. But even within this structure, individuality survived. Monks weren't identical. Some excelled at farming, others at scholarship. Some had beautiful voices and led chants during the divine office. Others couldn't carry a tune but copied manuscripts with flawless precision. Some monks were naturally contemplative, finding deep satisfaction in silent prayer. Others struggled, fighting boredom, doubt, or longing for the life they'd left behind. Not everyone who entered a monastery stayed. Young men sometimes realized, after months or years, that this life wasn't for them, and rules developed allowing them to leave if they chose, though social pressure often made departure difficult. The process of becoming a monk began with a period of discernment, often spent as a guest at the monastery, observing the routine and asking questions. If the candidate and the community both felt called, he entered as a novice, a trainee. Novices spent months or years learning the rules, the prayers, the sign language, the rhythms of monastic life. They worked alongside experienced monks, absorbing skills and values through apprenticeship. After this probationary period, if both the novice and the abbot agreed, the novice took vows. Poverty, chastity, obedience, and stability. Poverty meant owning nothing. Chastity meant celibacy. Obedience meant submitting to the abbot's authority. Stability meant remaining in that monastery for life, not wandering between communities. Taking vows was a solemn moment. The novice received the monastic habit, the distinctive robe that marked him as a monk. His hair was cut into a tonsure, a shaved circle on the crown of his head, leaving a ring of hair around the sides. The size of the tonsure varied by region and order, but the meaning was consistent. The monk was marked, set apart from the secular world. He belonged to God now, and his appearance announced it. Life as a monk wasn't easy, but it offered security that most medieval people never knew. A roof overhead, meals every day, medical care when sick, a community that would care for you in old age. For younger sons of noble families, who wouldn't inherit land, the monastery provided a respectable career. For peasants, it offered education and social mobility. Not every monk was deeply pious. Some joined for practical reasons, but the structure of monastic life had a way of shaping people over time. Years of prayer, even rote prayer, left marks. Years of silence created habits of reflection. Years of communal living taught patience, or at least tolerance. Monasteries didn't exist in isolation. They were economic and social centers. Local people came to monasteries for help during famines, for medical treatment, for education. Some monasteries ran schools, teaching Latin and basic literacy to boys from the surrounding area. Monasteries also served as inns, providing food and shelter to travelers. Hospitality was considered sacred. The rule of Saint Benedict insisted that guests be received as Christ himself, fed, housed, and treated with kindness. This wasn't always convenient. Guests disrupted routines, consumed resources, and sometimes behaved badly. But monks welcomed them anyway, because the rule demanded it. Economically, monasteries were often wealthy. Donations of land from nobles seeking spiritual favor meant that many monasteries controlled vast estates. They collected rents, sold surplus crops, traded wool, timber, fish, and wine. Some became powerful landlords, managing villages, employing laborers, and influencing local politics. This wealth created tension. Reformers regularly argued that monks had strayed from their vows of poverty, living too comfortably, eating too well, accumulating too much. New orders formed in response, seeking stricter adherence to the rule. The Cistercians, mentioned earlier, rejected the perceived laxity of traditional Benedictine houses. They built monasteries in remote areas, refused elaborate decorations, and insisted on manual labor. For a time, they succeeded. But wealth has a way of accumulating, and within generations, even Cistercian houses grew prosperous. The physical layout of a monastery reflected its purpose. At the center stood the church, the largest and most beautiful building. Around it clustered the cloister, a covered walkway enclosing a courtyard. The cloister connected the church to the dormitory, the refectory, the chapter house where monks met for discussions, and other essential buildings. The design encouraged movement between prayer, work, and rest without leaving the monastery's protected space. Beyond the cloister were workshops, stables, gardens, and sometimes a separate building for the infirmary. Larger monasteries had guest houses, brewhouses, bakeries, and granaries. The most impressive had elaborate sanitation systems, with latrines connected to drainage channels fed by diverted streams. Cleanliness was valued, both for health and as a symbol of spiritual purity. The abbot, the monastery's leader, held immense responsibility. He was elected by the monks, though in practice, politics and family connections often influenced the outcome. A good abbot balanced spiritual leadership with practical management. He had to ensure the monastery's financial health, maintain discipline, settle disputes, and represent the community to the outside world. He also had to embody the values he preached, living simply despite the authority he held. Not all abbots succeeded. Some were too lenient, others too harsh. Some focused on wealth at the expense of spirituality. But the best abbots were remembered for generations, their wisdom shaping the character of their communities long after their deaths. One aspect of monastic life that often surprises modern people is the emphasis on time. We think of the Middle Ages as a period when time was vague, imprecise, measured by the sun and seasons rather than clocks. For most people, that was true. But monasteries were different. They needed to coordinate the divine office, to know when to ring bells, when to gather for prayer. So they developed methods of timekeeping. Water clocks, hourglasses, and eventually mechanical clocks appeared in monasteries before anywhere else. Monks studied astronomy, tracking the movements of stars to calculate hours. They became experts in dividing the day and night into equal parts, adjusting for seasonal changes. This obsession with time wasn't secular. It was theological. God had created time, and honoring it properly was a form of worship. The 8 canonical hours themselves carried symbolic meaning. Matins, in the darkest part of night, represented vigilance and preparation. Lauds, at dawn, celebrated light conquering darkness. Prime, the first hour of daylight, marked the beginning of labor. Terce, at the third hour, commemorated the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. Sext, at midday, was a pause for reflection amid the day's heat and busyness. None, at the ninth hour, honored Christ's death on the cross. Vespers, at evening, gave thanks for the day's blessings. Compline, before sleep, prepared the soul for rest and, ultimately, death. Each hour had its purpose, its prayers, its place in the larger pattern. Together, they sanctified every moment, transforming ordinary time into sacred time. This sanctification extended to every aspect of life. Work wasn't just survival. It was spiritual discipline. Eating wasn't just nourishment. It was communion with God's creation. Silence wasn't just absence of noise. It was presence of mind. Medieval monks didn't separate the spiritual from the physical. Everything was woven together, each thread supporting the others. A loaf of bread was made by hands that had prayed, eaten by a body that would pray again, blessed by a God who provided the grain. Nothing was purely practical or purely holy. It was all both. For monks, this integration created a sense of purpose that most people in the medieval world lacked. Peasants worked to survive, always one bad harvest from disaster. Nobles fought to maintain power, always one rival from ruin. Merchants traded to accumulate wealth, always one shipwreck from bankruptcy. Monks worked for God, and God, they believed, was eternal. This gave their labor meaning beyond the immediate. A field plowed today fed the community tomorrow, but it also honored the Creator who made the soil fertile. A manuscript copied today preserved knowledge for future generations, but it also proclaimed the glory of the God who inspired the words. Even the simplest tasks, sweeping floors, mending clothes, carried weight because they were done in service of something greater. This isn't to say monks were immune to frustration, doubt, or despair. Some struggled with the restrictions. Some missed their families. Some questioned whether their vows had been a mistake. Medieval writers even had a term for the listlessness that could afflict monks, aesthesia, a spiritual numbness that made everything feel pointless. It was more than sadness. It was a deep, paralyzing apathy, a sense that the day would never end and nothing mattered. Monks fought aesthesia through discipline, through prayer, through physical labor that exhausted the body and quieted the restless mind. Not everyone won that fight. Some left. Some endured in misery. Others found peace, eventually, in the rhythms they had initially resented. The medieval monastery was not a utopia. It was a human institution, flawed and complicated, shaped by the people who lived there and the world around them. But it offered something rare in the Middle Ages: stability. In a time when war, disease, and famine could upend lives overnight, monasteries endured. They were anchors, physically and spiritually. They preserved knowledge when libraries burned. They fed the hungry when crops failed. They provided medical care when plague struck. They prayed when the world seemed to be falling apart, and their prayers, whether heard or not, gave people hope. For the monks themselves, the monastery was home. Not always comfortable, not always happy, but home nonetheless. The same walls that sheltered them also confined them. The same bells that structured their days also demanded obedience. The same vows that gave their lives meaning also limited their choices. It was a trade: freedom for purpose, individuality for community, worldly ambition for eternal devotion. Some embraced it. Others endured it. But for centuries, thousands of men chose this life, waking before dawn to pray, laboring through the day, and returning to prayer as darkness fell. They lived and died within those stone walls, and their lives, repetitive and ordinary as they seemed, kept something vital alive. When you visit the ruins of medieval monasteries today, you see crumbling walls, empty halls, silent cloisters overgrown with grass. The bells are gone. The prayers have stopped. But if you stand quietly, you can almost hear them: the shuffle of sandaled feet on stone, the murmur of chanted psalms, the creak of a door opening at dawn. These were places where time itself was honored, where every hour had its purpose, where the mundane and the sacred blended into something whole. The monks who lived there weren't saints. They were people, tired, hungry, sometimes bored, sometimes inspired, always human. But they built something that outlasted them. They created pockets of order in a chaotic world, and in doing so, they reminded everyone who came after that peace, however fragile, is possible. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of those monks rising in darkness, their breath visible in cold air, their voices lifting in unison. Think of the bells that marked each hour, the silence that filled the spaces between, the patient hands that copied words onto vellum, the fields that fed communities, the gardens that healed the sick. Think of a life measured not in achievements or possessions, but in prayers offered, duties fulfilled, and moments sanctified. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always happy. But it was, in its own way, profoundly peaceful. If you enjoyed this exploration of medieval monastic life, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these journeys possible. Until next time, sleep well.